Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending where we are on which uh, time set you are at. So I'm pleased. Thank you, LRB, for the presentation, and I'm very pleased to spend the next hour or so to talk about the macroeconomic, or more or less likely implications, macroeconomic implications of the current lockdown and pandemics, and I will make sure to leave time for questions, so we have time to interact about some issues. Let me share the screen to share with you some slides I have. Let's see if that works. There we go. I assume everybody sees the presentation right now. So just to introduce myself very shortly, I'm currently full professor of economics at the Business School of the University of Quebec at Montreal, where I'm attached to that university since 1988. But for 10 years, I was member, or about 9.5 years, I was member of the Quebec National Assembly, and I was one of the many economists advisors to the Premier of the government of Quebec, and I occupied different functions in parliaments, including that of State Minister for Finance, where I was involved in many economic policy decisions and directions of the government. As a macroeconomist, as a researcher, and as a consultant, occasionally for Setym International, I've been specialized in finance, macroeconomics, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and public debt management. And I've been giving some courses about, on average, about once a year about the management of public government budget and the management of public debt for Setym. So I'm pleased now to talk about some of those issues related to the current lockdown and pandemics of COVID-19. This outbreak certainly has been a major shock, which has changed the world quite significantly, both health-wise and economically wise. And many dimensions to be considered, and the two dimensions of health and economics have to be taken jointly. So what are the main macroeconomics effects of the great lockdown on regarding some key variables for business cycles and growth and development? What are the justifications for the fiscal and monetary policies that are generally being pursued by many countries, including, of course, advanced economies like the United States and Canada, but also and implications for developing countries? Of course, we're facing a very highly uncertain context, and the word uncertainty certainly is a key word in what we're talking about. So often we talk about the variance of a variable, but now we're talking about the variance of the variance of the variance of a variables, and sometimes we're not even sure about how to weight that variance. So many things are unknown with this new virus and the policies that we need to implement in that context. Nonetheless, despite this uncertainty that has to make sure that we remain humble about our analysis and thinking. At the same time, I mean, there are some anchored points from macroeconomics which are helpful to at least to better understand what are the likely implications of some of the aspects, what are the main issues we need to address, and how we can juggle and manage those different issues. From those key points, even though they are not the perfect models, as there was never any perfect models, but even in the current alternative context, some key points need to be always kept in mind if we want to be able to face the consequences of the lockdown and to be able to recover from it, and hopefully while minimizing as much possible the death as well as the economic implications of that lockdown. So basically, just as a prologue, before the crisis started, I mean, we think that the virus started somewhere in the late fall, maybe in China, but I mean, yeah, obviously, there's been many ways that, given the large interactions between people in the world, in open world as we are now, obviously, I mean, the propagation started slowly, but then suddenly it peaked in many countries. Italy was, I mean, first China, then Italy was greatly hit, and then propagated all over the world. So before that virus hit and the pandemic started, until last February, basically since the 2007-2009 Great Recession, which was accompanied by both an economic crisis and a financial crisis, many developed economies had experienced one of the longest expansion historically. Uh, Basically, the expansion was in the 11th year, both in the United States and in Canada. Of course, we always say that an expansion doesn't die from age. Basically, there needs to be some shock hitting the economy that starts the hence this expansion. So before the current crisis, the unemployment rates reached very low levels, even historically, like it was 2.5% in the United States last February. Uh, Inflation, both observed inflation and expected inflation, is very low. By all standards, many countries have inflation below or somewhat below 2%. Uh, the growth rate of real GDP, that is the gross domestic product or overall production in the economies, adjusted for inflation, remain low compared to what it used to be, let's say in the 60s or 70s. Nonetheless, there was a steady growth rate of the economy. We wish it would be higher than it was, but at least it was positive and seemed to be going very fine up to until for the last 11 years until February. The stock markets were doing very well. I mean, of course, even the President of the United States was very happy about claiming every time the Dow Jones or the Standard & Poor's 500 reach higher levels. I mean, he took credit for it. Well, that's a different story. And the US economy seems even somewhat resilient up to that point to even some crazy policies, like protectionist trade policies, followed by the American government and the rhetoric of that president. Of course, I mean, some uncertainty and significant uncertainty was arising, and there was the federal debt in the United States was rising quite significantly, especially thanks to the 2017 tax cut package that was aiming at some important change that needed to be made, but was done in a fairly poorly manner. So, which basically was financed by permanent tax cuts, financed by deficits, which obviously was not sustainable over the longer term. Then February arrived, and in mid-February, the COVID-19 pandemics hits the world. Since then, we've become familiar, or may have become familiar with the three initials S, I, and R for the SIR model, which dates from the 1927 research paper by Kermark and McKendricks, which basically is a system of differential equations that describes how a propagation is occurring for a pandemic, for a virus, for a contagious disease. So from this model, we're able to simulate the propagation of the contagious disease by figuring out what are the degree of infectiousness of the disease, the degree of mortality or lethalness of the disease, and how much contact people have with each other. And one key parameter in that model is the R0 statistics, which basically is what we call the basic reproduction number that represents the expected number of infections directly generated by one infected person in a population where basically everybody is eventually susceptible to get that disease. So there are susceptible people, infected people, and recovered people, and there's some of those three components, three groups of people basically define the populations. And this R0 statistics not that easy to estimate. There is some history has been done for some past infectious disease spreads like the HIV/AIDS, SARS, a common cold, COVID-19, obviously, and those numbers fluctuate quite a bit. I mean, for instance, for influenza, it's between 1.4 to 2.8, which is the pandemic of the Spanish influenza, basically. COVID is between 1.84 to 5.7, depending on which countries. And this number, which is very key to understand how fast disease can contaminate and propagate through the society or through a country. And those values, I mean, are based on past outbreaks, but they may not be valid for current outbreaks of the same disease because things change. The communication, maybe the contacts can be higher between people. The disease may evolve and become more contagious and so on. So we cannot change R0 vaccination, although vaccination is very important to get rid of the disease eventually. But other changes in the population's susceptibility can be affecting R naught. For instance, physical distancing, different public policy or social interventions are key to decrease R naught. And that's one of the things we talked about right now when we want to flatten the curve of the pandemics. If we look to just give an example of how important, how much the world has changed as of mid-February, and it was a tremendous change. Here, first of all, you have the 1919, the share of different countries in the world economy. The United States representing about 25% of the economy. China, 16%, is the second largest GDP in the world, followed by Japan for 6%, Germany 4%, India 3%. UK would be about 3%, about the same size as India. But if you see that from the countries to the 6th to 10th ranking represent 13% of the world economy, 11, 20 or 13%, and the rest of the world 20%. If you talk about the European Union, it represents 21%. Now, if we look at the IMF forecast for GDP for the whole year of 2020 as of January 2020. So in January 2020, the IMF published some forecasts for the whole year of 2020 for GDP growth. In April, those forecasts were revised. Well, what happened for the world economy in January? The IMF was forecasting a 3.3% real GDP growth rate for 2020. In April, it was revised to minus 3% over the whole year. For advanced economies, in January, the forecast was a 1.6% positive growth rate. In April, it was revised to minus 6.1% growth rate. For the US, it moved from 2% to minus 5.9%. For the euro, from 1.2% to minus 7.5%. For emerging and developing Asia, it moved from 5.8 to only positive 1%. China from 6% went to 1.2%. And this is overall GDP identified by population. So of course, I mean, if you look at GDP per capita, I mean, even a 1.2% positive for China is negative in terms of per capita. Emerging and developing Europe from 2.6 moved to minus 5.2%. If you look at Middle East, Northern Africa, and Central Asia, from 2.8, it was moved to minus 2.8% for the whole year of 2020. From Sub-Saharan African countries, it was forecasted to be 2.5% for the whole year as of January 2020. But in April, the forecast was reversed downward and were downgraded to minus 1.6%. And once again, this is not per capita. Obviously, the world had changed tremendously. In the United States alone, which is, of course, the most important economy size-wise in the world, often we report the GDP in annualized rates. That means that we look at what would have happened to the level of GDP if the growth rate in a quarterly basis had persisted over the whole year. So from the first quarter of 2020 compared to the fourth quarter of 2019, the growth rate happened to be, that's not a forecast, the realization was minus 1.2% over only one quarter. If you compound this for the whole year, if the same drop in the first quarter of 2020 was replicated for the whole year of 2020, that means the minus 4.7% negative growth rate over the whole year. For the second quarter of 2020, we still have projections. We don't have all the data for the second quarter, obviously. From compared to the first quarter of 2020, the forecasts are between minus 8.5 to minus 11% at a quarterly rate, which means that the annualized rates minus 30%, between minus 30 and minus 37%. Most people seem to think that the growth rate over the quarter will be minus 10% over the second quarter, which represents minus 35%, or just about minus 35% over an annual rate. By comparison, in the last Great Recession of 2007 and 2009, the largest quarterly US GDP decline was minus 8.4% at an annual rate, Over the 4 years, the GDP went down, fell by less than 5%. Well, now we're talking about minus 10% at a quarterly rate or minus 34% at an annual rate if it goes on for the whole year at the same pace. If you compare with the Great Depression of 2019, 1929, 1933, the US real GDP fell over 4 years by 30% in annual rise rate. We're talking about minus 34% over 1 quarter at an annualized rate. Obviously, it's a big hit for the economy. In unemployment, the official unemployment rate we have from now from 1948 onward in the United States was 3.5% in last February. It was 14.7% in mid-April 2020. And this may have been underestimated because there is some issues about maybe some misclassification of people as not being as not being counted as unemployed, even though they were. But if we take the official number, it's still a movement from 3.5 to 40.7% unemployment rate. In May, we expect the unemployment rate to be near or above 20%. In comparison, during the last Great Recession in 2007, 2009, the unemployment rate reached 10% for the highest level reached in October 2009. During the Great Depression, we don't have the exact official numbers. There have been some assessment of estimates of what the unemployment rate would have been, and it reached probably something like 24.9% in 1929, 1933. Once again, it's a big hit. A bad but big hit. Now, all this evolved in a very uncertain environment about the pandemics. This coronavirus is a new virus. Despite one of the advisors to Donald Trump seems to suggest it's not COVID-19 because the 19th COVID is the first COVID-19. 1919 refers to the year where the virus appeared, basically. And it seems to cause primarily serious lung inflammatory infections that can degenerate into a fatal outcome. It seems also to attack other organs like kidneys, heart, and skin. It seems to affect the circulatory systems, like creating multiple blood clots. Either those effects on different organs are directly because of the virus itself, or indirectly because of the response of the immune system to the virus. The uncertainty arises also because of the fact that it's a new virus. We're still learning about what it means, but we are not quite sure about the quality of the estimate and the accuracy of the estimate of R0. That is the propagation, basically, parameter or reproduction parameter of the virus. And especially the other complication is that asymptomatic infected people seem to be transmitting the disease even though they don't have any symptoms. Also, we're not quite sure about the short-run and long-run health impacts of that virus. What is the mortality rate? What about the quality of the data on which we can assess the way this virus is propagating? It's a function of the types and the quantity of tests that are performed in different countries. And some countries have been performing more tests per capita than others. The types of tests may differ. The tests may not be always that accurate. They can lead to a very significant number of false negative or important numbers of false positives. Even like the test that the White House is using to see if someone has been having the antibodies that have appeared because of the contact with disease. The recent analysis of those tests seem to say that those tests are accurate at 50% in terms of creating false negatives. So it's quite a high degree of inaccuracy. There is an issue also about the way the data are reported. Not all countries are reporting the data the same way or in accurate manner in terms of infection or in terms of death from the disease. Like some states in the United States then report the people who died in nursing homes. So you can imagine that this underestimates maybe the death in some states in the United States and maybe something in other countries. What about the degree of immunity that is provided to a person that has been infected once? Is there immunity? Does this immunity last, and for how long does it last? These are all kind of questions that are we have to bear, and we hopefully will get better answers as time goes by in order to be able to gauge the impact on the society and the impact on the economy. So that leads us to maybe two curves or two type of curves that we need to take into account: the pandemic curve and the recession curve. Basically, like you have the pandemic curve here that says, I mean, as time goes by, how many people are affected by or infected by the virus. It goes up quite quickly at first, then it reaches a peak and then goes down. One issue, of course, is, I mean, if that many people are hit by or infected by the disease, number of cases increases significantly and quickly. One issue is that the health system, the public and private health system, may not be able to cope with the capacity that they have in terms of ICU beds, in terms of way to treat people who are infected. So this is the horizontal line here represents the healthcare system capacity. So the idea of flattening the curve is to at least be able to slow down the propagation of the disease so that the number of cases arising doesn't reach a peak, too high a peak and not too quickly, so that we don't go over the healthcare system capacity. That's the first flattening of the curve we've heard about. We can think about flattening of a curve now in terms of recession, because this pandemic creates a recession in two ways, possibly. First of all, the measures we need to take into account to be able to flatten the pandemic curve through different kind of measures means that we can go through a lot, and that's what we've done. We're going through a lockdown of many sectors of the economy. By locking down and closing down the working of some sectors of the economy, this provokes a recession. We'll get back to that. Now, if there was no measures, no appropriate public health containment measures to stop the pandemic or to slow down the propagation of the pandemic, there would also be a recession. Then that recession would arise from people dying, from people reacting because of panicking or precautionary measures of households and firms faced with that uncertainty, this high uncertainty I talked about a slide ago, of dealing with a pandemic. And this will provoke a recession as well. Now, some macro measures through fiscal policy, monetary policy, may help and will show that they help to flatten the recession curve. Now, therefore, we need to worry about how to mitigate both the health impact and the economic impact of the recession. And this is not an easy trade-off. It's not a fair trade-off, and that we should need to choose either one or the other. We need to find a way to deal with both flattening the pandemic curve and flattening the recession curve. We need to take into account the short run and the long run impacts of the lockdown. So the question is how to dampen, if not eliminate, all the negative feedback loops that amplify the recessionary impacts of the different public health containment measures, and hopefully possibly to shorten the length and the depth of a recession. Now, how can we contain the pandemic? There has been some non-pharmaceutical intervention in social distancing that has led to the lockdown in the first responsible response. Social distancing, which are more costly to the economy, hopefully restricting testing quarantine, which hopefully will be less costly to the economy, but then we need to be able to track, we need to be able to test accurately, and we need to quarantine people who have been affected by the disease and are contagious. There's been various models and fairly broad and sensible economic consensus emerging that we cannot and should not separate the public and economic dimensions of the lockdown. In particular, Ekenbaum, Ribello, and Traban, three American economists, have developed an extension of the SIR model that we call the SIR macro model, where they studied interactions between economic decisions and the epidemics or the pandemics. And they showed that by taking into account the individual decision making to decide how much they consume, how much they decide to work, because they want to maximize their welfare subject to their budget constraints, taking into account the three classes of people: the susceptible, the recovery people, and the infected people. By resolving the problems, we're able to figure out what this kind of trade-off economically there is. Even an abstract, very simple version of the model they've developed so far, not taking into account the macro measures that we can take to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemics, taking into account some rough value just as a benchmark of $9.5 million per life, which is the kind of measure that the U.S. government agencies use to take into account the impact of pollution on people's life. Then we're able to find that, that first of all, facing a pandemic, people will decide to cut back on consumption and reduce their work, which will reduce the severity of the epidemics, but at a cost, and also reduce the number of deaths. But this will exacerbate, as a counterpart, the size of recession caused by the epidemic. And we saw that there are both supply and demand impacts on economic activity. And they find, even with a simple abstract model, that both fiscal and monetary policy response not being taken into account, not taking into account some other long-term negative impact of the pandemics that may also occur over the long term. They show that a year-long lockdown, that they say hopefully will give us the time to find a vaccine or develop a vaccine within a year, will represent a 22% downfall of production, which will represent about $4.2 trillion in losses in the United States. Without containment measures, a 7%, that would lead to a 7% contraction in GDP, but 500,000 additional, or 500,000 additional lives will be lost. So if we assume a price, just a cost of $9.7 million for a cost of life, plus the 7% contraction in GDP, this would correspond to roughly to a $6.1 trillion loss. So this means that we cannot just think in terms of short terms when we think about trade-off between economics and health. In order to be able to get a sustainable recovery, we need to beat the disease. That's why the lockdown was important. It's not an issue of either one or the other. It's find the best way to both minimize the death, minimize the health costs, and at the same time mitigate the impact on the economy. Some sectors are affected, but first of all, it's a worldwide shocks. There are labor supply and labor demand shocks. There is a supply shock on goods and services, basically because of the activities are shut down, especially activities linked to more proximity, restaurants, travels, public transportation, and so on, retail sales. Because of breakdowns in the supply chain worldwide, because of people working less hours and people working less because they're shut down, this is akin to a productivity shock with direct effects, wealth effect, and substitution effects. It is also a goods and service demand shock because aggregate demand will go down, because the aggregate consumption will go down worldwide, as well as investment goes down, investment demand. Basically, because of the wealth effect, people being less wealthy because of the shutdown, because of the increased level of uncertainty, people decide to postpone consumption to later. Therefore, there's a significant decrease in current aggregate consumption, both for non-durable goods and services, as well as for durable goods. Because of the decrease in the market productivity of physical capital, because of the higher uncertainty, private investment goes down as well. And all this at the same time where aggregate supply goes down and aggregate demand goes down. The aggregate demand goes down as so much that even this puts downward pressure on the world interest rates. So one of the reasons why the interest rates are low right now, even not talking yet about monetary policy having its own effect, is the supply and demand shocks of the economy, which put pressure down on the world interest rates. And of course, the disruptions in the job markets implies also an increased unemployment. Some sectors are more affected than others. The proximity sectors, which are essentials, deemed essentials, like the health provisions, food provisions, are less affected. The sectors in which we can conduct work online or can work from telework, work from home, also are less affected. To give you some examples, Tingle and Nyman recently have estimated in the United States about 34% of US jobs can be performed at home. And this represents about 44% of the overall wages in the United States. Of course, this number varies across cities and across industries. The top 5 industries, which are where you can think about telework, are professional, scientific and technical services, management of companies, enterprises, educational services, finance and insurance, and information. But the bottom 5 industries where it's harder to perform work from home, of course, transportation and warehousing, construction, retail sale, agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, accommodation, and food services. For developing countries, the number is about 13% of workers could work from home, and it varies from 5% in Ghana to 22% in Yunnan, China. And basically, people who can work from home generally represent higher paying occupations. In South Africa, we have some estimates. It's about also 13.8% of people that can work, let's say, easily from home. So it's not everybody who can do that. All sectors of workers are affected the same in terms of health risk and economic risk as well. There is an impact which differs and it varies. So basically, the more proximity there is, the higher the health risk. And the economic risk if it's an essential sector. And this brings some cascading effects. Now, what are the post-response? Health-wise, of course, there is the non-pharmaceutical interventions like hand washing, wearing masks, keeping a 2-meter distance between people, investments in personal protective equipment for health workers, tracking, testing, quarantine, and lockdown, which was obviously the thing we needed to do at the beginning, and we needed at least, and we still may need to do for quite a while, at least in some sectors of the economy. Now, in terms of monetary policy interventions, central banks, especially in the United States, but everywhere, personally, have moved in terms of being able to provide more liquidity into the system. The interest rates were already fairly low, but they were pushed towards the zero rate in the United States, we call it the zero lower bound, as we call it. Some countries have experienced somewhat negative interest rates, but basically there's not much margin of maneuver to put down the interest rate lower than 0% or slightly negative numbers. So the central banks have acted with what we call unconventional monetary policy tools by opening a series of credit facilities designed to support the functioning of financial markets. This to be able to the markets. We'll help you if we need to. We're going to borrow. We're going to print money or lend money, print money in order to buy government bonds, which they did before, to buy private bonds for corporations, and even to do, in some cases, direct loans to private sectors. Also, central bank have announced through policy announcements, like in the United States, they've announced that they would be ready and steady to act even more if they need to, in order to be able to assure more liquidity in the system. And the reason why they're saying that, and so far it's credible, and especially because of the 2007 and 2009 experience of the Great Recession, is that we want to avoid to have a liquidity trap, or at least, such an insufficiency of liquidity that this provocates an financial crisis on top of the current crisis. Because the financial crisis would certainly be a guarantee of a permanent lower path for the economy. So far, the Fed intervention has done what it had to do in that regard, and most central banks are doing that. But of course, it works so far, but it may be more limited to foster the recovery. Basically, one image we often use in economics, that if you think of a rope and you attach a table with a rope, and if you pull the rope, the table will follow. If you push the rope, the table will not move. So that's one of the issues. There is a risk of losing the central bank's independence vis-a-vis the fiscal authority. As we'll talk in a moment, the fiscal authority running big deficits, increasing debt. There is a risk to the central banks that will have a lot of pressure eventually from the fiscal authority or the budget authority to keep printing money even after the current crisis. There is a risk of losing its credibility for the central bank vis-a-vis the expectation of inflation. Those are fairly anchored down at a very low level now. But eventually, there is a risk if the central bank is not able to deleverage what they will have done with their balance sheet by putting so much liquidity in the economy. They need to make a sponge to soak back this excess liquidity eventually. Another risk is that this kind of monetary policy may be doping unduly the financial markets after the recovery. Even though there's not that much price inflation in terms of goods and services, there could be asset price inflation, and therefore there could be create some bubbles in the financial markets, which will be another risk for the future of the economy eventually. So this has to be kept in mind. In terms of fiscal policy response, basically fiscal policy have acted to facilitate workers that are either to remain employed. They've done that in Europe by paying firms. They say, well, we're going to pay part of the wages of salary to keep them working. If some people are forced to stay home and some firms close down, then at least during the lockdown, then basically the governments are acting through fiscal policy to help households in making some basic payments like rent, utilities, mortgages, insurance. They also are providing some assistance to help firms in weathering the storm, hopefully by preventing them to go into bankruptcy. It may help for at least some of the sectors of the economy and some industries, or some firms. Now, the issue, the longer it lasts, there could be some firms which will be affected eventually. They also may support the financial system as non-performing loans will mount, so to ensure crisis or morph into a financial crisis. So obviously, this is accompanied by a major increase in the government budget deficits that translate in higher public debt GDP ratios. Just to give you some examples, as of early May, in Britain and the United States, you see now it's forecasted that the debt GDP ratio will reach a very high level that we haven't rarely seen, at least except during the Second World War, we even reach a higher level. Not a little bit more in the United States, much more in Britain. And even if you go back in the 19th century, you see that the United States will have a much higher debt GDP ratio than historically in Britain as well. Now, the direction of debt GDP ratio may be what matters most in terms of negative impact on GDP growth. Not as much the level as if you are on an unstable path, corrections would need to be applied, either through cutting government expenditure in the future or raising taxes. In the short term, for now, short and long-term nominal interest rates remain low. And this is saying, well, it's a good time for the government to borrow because the cost of debt servicing is low. You can borrow even for 10 or 20 years, even at a low interest rate. However, it is not clear that interest rates will remain low. They are for now, and that's good. But eventually, the key variable for the dynamics of the GDP ratio is a gap or the difference between the nominal interest rate on the debt paid by the government and the growth rate of the economy. As of now, the growth rate of the economy, when the recovery starts, hopefully will be higher than the nominal interest rate, which means that the debt GDP ratio will be kept on check. We checked out basically. But as the growth rate, if the growth rate doesn't go recover that much, and interest rate go up eventually, then we could embark into a less and maybe in some worst case unsustainable debt evolution of the debt to GDP ratio. And we have to remember right now that basically most countries, if not all countries, are borrowing more for good reason. I think it's justified. But that means that given the world is a closed economy because the Martians don't lend us anything, that means we're going to borrow from the Martians. That means a higher demand for lendable funds worldwide will tend to push up worldwide interest rates, which will affect private investment in all countries in the world. Even if the government can borrow at a lower rate, private firms are not borrowing at the government rate. And in an uncertain and risky context, that means there's also a risk premium on corporate bonds compared to government bonds. And if this goes up, this will have any negative impact on the economy. And furthermore, the debt services, that is interest paid by the government on the outstanding debt, will take more and more room in the overall budget of the government, leaving less room for spending on health, education, or other services or even public infrastructures that the government may need to do. Now, what kind of recovery can we expect? And there is some kind of geometry now, which I will summarize, which will be, and I'm about done. I should be done in about 5 minutes or so. So basically, I mean, if you are very optimistic, we would like to have a Z-shaped recovery. Basically, I mean, GDP was on its positive trend growth rate, say, then it went down the lockdown, and then people have postponed some restaurant meals, trips, and so on. They just delayed them, and once the pandemic stops, then everybody will just kind of recuperate what they've missed and just eat more in restaurants and do more trips and compensate so that we can have a Z-shaped recovery before going back on the long-term trend of GDP. Well, this is a very optimistic view of the world. It's not very likely. A still very optimistic or somewhat optimistic view of the recovery would be the V-shaped recovery. At the beginning in March, we tended to think that probably there's some likelihood that V-shape is possible. Well, now the more we learn about this pandemics, about this virus, the more we learn about the impact on the economy. This is maybe still be too optimistic. These trips that were taken, restaurant meals were not purchased, concerts were not attended, are gone, bygones are bygones. They are delayed, but once life returns to normal, everything would have been as before. A somewhat pessimistic and probably more likely recovery is a U-shaped recovery. Basically, the level of GDP goes down with the pandemics and the lockdown. Then it goes up slowly, but eventually we go back to the long-term path. Another type of somewhat pessimistic and also still fairly likely is what's called the Nike swoosh recovery, because it looks like the Nike symbol on the shoes that Nike sells, like basketball shoes or running shoes. And basically, we see that you have the lockdown that brings down the economy, GDP, and then it goes up a bit fast, but then it still remains below and takes quite some time before reaching back the long-term trend of the economy. And before we get back to pre-pandemic trajectory of GDP. Another possible recovery is a W-shaped recovery, which is not as fun. I mean, which is even more, I mean, it's not fun at all, but I mean, it's somewhat discouraging. Basically, you're on a way of recovery, but then a second wave hits and we need to lock down again, which is not impossible, as we know, because I think it's fairly sure there'll be like there's the 1918 Spanish flu pandemics. There were 4 waves of the pandemics, and other kind of pandemics we've seen, I mean, often have many waves. So I don't think it's not an issue whether there will be a second wave. There will be one, I believe. The question is, how deep will it be, and when will it hit? That's the question. But this could provoke this kind of W-shaped recovery. Now, the most pessimistic recovery that we hope we're able to avoid, but we're not sure yet, is the L-shaped recovery. The L-shaped recovery is what happened with the Great Recession of 2017, 2019. Basically, because of the financial crisis that hit, despite the fiscal stimulus package, despite the monetary policy followed by the Federal Reserve, it took 6 years for the per capita GDP to return to 2007 levels, and it's well below the pre-recession projection. So this kind of permanent impact on GDP is not impossible. It is still likely, and the way we'll be engineering the opening of the economy will be key, and we'll be able to also get control on pandemics through cure, treatments, tracking, testing, quarantining people who are infected will be important as well. So the damage to the economy will be dependent on the households' ability and willingness to spend. So how nervous will this still be in 3 months, in 4 months, 6 months, in a year from now? If government's fiscal flexibility is not that high for the United States so far, for the US government, it's fairly easy to borrow, especially because the US dollars remains the preferred reserve currency worldwide, and interest rates are low. I have some nuance I brought about earlier. But for local and state government in the United States, who are limited in their capacity to borrow, and who are giving like proximity services in terms of managing the health system, and so on, in terms of defense, even, or I mean, in terms of police work, and we'll see what happens in the recent days. Given all that, I mean, for them, I mean, it's harder for them to borrow. For developing countries, which will be facing also some credit rating capacity, or which may be limited, it will be harder for them as well to face or to use the fiscal tools to mitigate the impact of the lockdown. If businesses are affected by important bankruptcies and lower investment, and this contaminates as well the banking and financial sector, this also could be an impact which would be long-lasting and creating an L-shaped recovery. Also, the extent of lost human capital when people lose their job, and if the matching between workers and firms is not done as easily because people lose some of the capacities and aptitudes that they developed and skills and the experience that they developed in the job market, or people have harder time to get into their first job, this will have some long-run effect as well. Clearly, it is easier to lock down than it's harder to reopen the economy. There are many sources and high level of uncertainty vis-a-vis the course of the pandemics. There may be many waves, as I mentioned. It may take some time to develop some treatments. How long will it take? It will be possible to find a vaccine, and how long will it take? Is it possible? Generally, it's 12 to 18 months horizon that is mentioned right now, but it's appeared to be very optimistic. It may be possible. I'm not sure it's very likely if I base the evidence based on the history of vaccine development for other diseases in the world. How long will it take, even if we discover this vaccine? We hope so. How long will it take to make it available worldwide in sufficient quantities? How will this be paid? How will this be made available to all countries? What about the herd immunity? Can the world get to that point? And if so, at which private and social cost? Well, this may well depend again on the availability of a cure and the availability and the good performance of good testing to track, test, and quarantine. And this would be important, like the pandemics may be affecting people differently according to age. So maybe in some countries, if some people are more susceptible to be affected than others, then maybe we're able to isolate some sectors or some people in the economy more easily if people accept to do so. Maybe we need to reopen the US economy or the economy of the countries, one industry at a time. And that depends maybe on different angles, different issues. Maybe some sectors which are more proximity, maybe the last ones to reopen, except if those sectors are key for health reasons. And also we need to think about people who will be facing high economic risk, or because they have low incomes and they may be susceptible to lose their job for a long time. So how do we deal with this arbitrage there? We need to take into account all the angles. People, will they still remain compliant if the current COVID-19 wave lasts or if other waves arise? It seems that people are becoming more impatient with the lockdown, as we see in every country in the world, in the United States, and despite even which is accentuated by the current events right now. But also, I mean, if you look at even in Canada, I'm sure worldwide, after a few weeks, it's okay, a few months, well, but now the longer the lockdown or the confinement lasts, people seem to be becoming more and more increasingly unsatisfied with that lockdown. There are issues of individual rights and freedom. There seems to be an increasing distrust or lack of trust in government information and policy interventions. This is amplified by the lack of confidence in institutions in many countries, and we have seen way before even the COVID-19 pandemics. There are some game theoretical considerations between the government and society, and even different segments of society. There is a big risk of revive and amplify protectionism to push countries to turn inward. This would be a big mistake. This would bring a high cost on developing countries, a very high cost on lower income households, even in advanced countries, economically speaking. And there's an excellent book by Baldwin and Newsnet which talks of many issues there. Because this protectionism basically decreases the marginal productivity of labor and physical capital, therefore it decreases wages or capacity of rising wages for workers, capacity of firms to compete, their profits, therefore it decreases the overall production and income in the economy. This increases the cost of of goods and services within a country, which increases the purchasing power of households by reducing real wage, real profits, and so on. Also, not everyone is impacted the same way by the pandemics, both health-wise and economically wise. There are issues of social and economic inequalities. The unintended consequences of fiscal monetary policy also may be important in an unchanging environment. Even with good intentions, it's possible there are some unintended consequences. I talked about the greater importance of debt services, future tax increases on labor income, capital income, consumption, lower levels of government spending, future inflation, social and political tension and strain on institutions, depending on the resiliency and the respect and trust of the people. Basically, as a conclusion, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but there are big challenges. And more than ever, we need common sense. We need cooperation across countries. We need to be able to learn from the mistakes of the past, not to repeat the mistakes of the past. This is true for economics. We still don't have the answers to every question, obviously, both on the health issues and on economic issues. But I think we're able to do so. The world I've shown in the past, they've been able to fight and to win big battles. But obviously, there are really key issues that we need to be able to deal with, and economics as some partial answers to that, which we should not forget. But we need to all work all together to be able to face that. Thank you. So I'll be open, of course, obviously, for questions.
Thank you very much, Alain, for this great detailed analysis. I mean, and thanks as well for sharing your crystal ball with us. I'm Jean-Michel Dayav, Director of Setym International, and we will handle a few questions, not all because we could go on for hours, days, weeks, months, because this crisis all affect us at various levels. First, we have Dr. Mutua from Kenya, who is asking us for regarding developing countries. They have implemented in Kenya, like many other countries, some various economic stimulus packages for to caution households from the shock of the crisis. Do such stimulus programs always work? Is it wise to do so given the narrow revenue gaps in such countries and the high indebtedness? Sorry.
Well, thank you for the question. It's obviously a good and important question, and it's a key question. And especially, I mentioned earlier, one of the issues for developing countries, they may be the first ones to pay the price for even the advanced countries' increase in public debt. And of course, we cannot erase all the past debt just with a magic wand. At the same time, we need to facilitate. And I mean, I think the kind of example, and I think we need, first of all, I think those policies, even the fiscal stimulus packages, even in developing countries, are as important as they are in developed, so-called developed or advanced countries. At the same time, I think we need world cooperation. We need the kind of incentive or kind of measures that the IMF and the World Bank have started, and other world financial institutions, whether the bank, the developing banks, and so on, I mean, have been put forward. And I think the more work needs to be done on that. I think everybody has to realize we are on board. If the so-called developed countries don't assist correctly, with the right incentives, obviously, because you don't want to say, oh yeah, we forget the debt, and after that, we start all over again. We can do that directly, obviously. There has to be some balance to prevent what we call a moral hazard problem, which will create more havoc in the future. At the same time, we still need to do something as advanced countries, and cooperation is key. And at the same time, I mean, and all the accompaniment there from the developed countries will be important. And because if the developed world doesn't realize that and say, well, we don't care about the developing countries, and protectionism would be such an example of mismanagement and of mishandling of the situation for the developing countries. I mean, if we don't do that, I mean, of course, it means that pandemics and the many waves and there will be other coronaviruses or other, most likely in the future, unfortunately. We've been 5 years and 10 years, 20 years, we don't know. But it's unlikely there will never be any other one. But even the current one will have possibly many waves. But if we want to lower those weights, we need to work together with the developing countries, I believe.
And how about if we continue with developing, so-called developing countries? Mr. Francis Otis Frimpong, I would guess from Nigeria, is what do you do in such a situation that, because you have no options to do it, to try to put in place some programs, but that in your economy, 80% or more of the citizens are from the informal sector? How do you deal with it? It's not as easy as in developing countries.
That is right. That's a very good point. I didn't think about mentioning it, but I agree with you. In that context, we wish we could jumpstart and say, okay, let's put all the mechanisms that we have to be able to have some automatic fiscal stabilizer and people get direct checks. So, one possibility would be to use what they call helicopter drops of money. Basically, when central bank basically adds some money and basically find ways people go and get somebody. There is a big danger, obviously, unfortunately, because we still have in mind there are some any country eventually can say, oh yeah, we'll start that, we'll do it again next time before an election or for some other reason, and then we'll lose the credibility of the central bank and the independence of the central bank vis-a-vis the fiscal authority. So this has to be very, very well framed if we use that path. So there's a real one-shot deal, which there has to be a and to commit governments that they won't resort to that kind of printing money issue, like we've seen in Zimbabwe in another context, as we've seen in Venezuela right now in another context, because you want to avoid to fall into hyperinflation. So that's a big danger. So I think that we need to find ways, we need to be innovative in ways to assist people in those informal sectors. That's a key point.
Thank you. I hope Mr. Frimpong, sorry, not from Nigeria, but from Ghana, he specified. Now, I think we will ask you to wrap it up with your crystal ball, your magic crystal ball, about what's going to happen in the future. First, we've got 2-3 questions that are not about what we're doing now, what has happened, what has been the impact, but what will happen. What, in your opinion, if the pandemic persists for another 3 months or more, what will happen to stock markets? I rephrase it. If the pandemic persists for another 3 months, when do we expect stock market to recover, especially in developing countries?
Well, the key thing in any situation is to work on the fundamentals. The fundamentals, you want to have a competitive industries, you want to invest in education, you want to help in at least basic health provision to lower the impacts of tropical diseases from the malaria and all that's our fundamentals. Increase productivity, which means that even like primary education, secondary education, and higher level education. And this remains true no matter what time we are. Some good public infrastructures are important as well. Now, the danger for the stock markets, and we've seen that in the United States. I attended a webinar earlier this week from an eminent professor from the University of Rochester, who was saying, and I think I would quote him, and because I agree with him, he was kind of puzzled to see how much the market fell, the U.S. stock market fell in March at the beginning of the pandemics. And is that we are as puzzled about the rise, we're seeing the fast rise in the stock market. So of course, over the higher frequencies, like daily, weekly, monthly, there is a lot of noise around it. So we need to move away from the noise, try to get the right signal. And the right signal for the markets has to be has to be based on sound fundamentals of the economy, fiscal policy wise, structurally wise, private sector wise, so that they invest in ways to make their industry more competitive and more competitive and more productive. Productivity is the key. We wish we'd have a magic quantity. Yeah, it is, then productivity rises, but it's not the way it does. Often I say, it's true for personal decisions, it's true in private sector, it's true for government policies. Good decisions don't have instantaneous effects, but bad decisions have a long-lasting effect. Yeah. So we need to really to work on long-lasting effects for the stock market to be able to to be not to go into some bubble and that will unravel in some with some irrational exuberance, as one of the Nobel Prize in economics as I call it.
Hmm. And just to conclude on one last opinion of yours, whatever the shape it will take, the W shape, the L shape, the V shape, whatever we believe in, the new normal, because I think we can all agree it will not go back to the same thing as it was before. What you think can the solution that we're trying to put in place to solve this crisis can generate other crises? I'm taking here 2-3 questions or comments. For instance, if we're talking about people working more from home for now on, there will be less needs for office space, so it might generate a crisis in this sector. Or will it push, for instance, company to automate more their line of work, and then creating less jobs because they would fear a second or third or fourth crisis coming? What do you feel like? Sometimes, I mean, there's no one word solution,
Sure.
one word answer to this, but if we may conclude on.
Sure, but that's another very good question. Like all the ones we formulated for people, our whole people who are saying the same. I thank them, and I thank them for their participation today. Um, well, I mean, in a sense, yeah, that's right. That it may exacerbate some changes. It make them quicker. I mean, I think that we were moving towards more work at home. It'd be good for the economy, for the environment, especially. I mean, if people have to spend less time commuting, if spend time commuting in with private cars and making, of course, CO2. This could be good in that regard. But I mean, I think this change was to come eventually. We kind of forced to do it more quickly. Sometimes we say that necessity is the mother of invention or the mother of innovation. And in that sense, I mean, that this quick change, I mean, will of course affect some sectors. There'll be some shifts, some substitution from some sectors to the others, and we may, and there could be some need to have some assistance to help the transition. I think that's important, but we shall not. I think we should not. Probably like fight any of those all those changes, because first of all, we won't be able to change to prevent them. They were going to come anyway, but at the same time, I think we need to find a way so that like even like in education. I mean, many of my colleagues, I mean, and myself, well, we prefer teaching a course in class, but well, we had to adapt and we had to find ways to deliver services. And it's of course, I mean, communication. I mean, I think nothing will never replace an in-person meeting. I mean, we're still humans, and I mean, I mean, robust can be helpful. Virtual tools can be helpful, I mean, but it doesn't mean we have to prevent any such human contacts in the future. But we need maybe to choose the right moment, the right ways to do them, maybe not the same frequency as we used to, and we can be gaining in terms of quality of life if we do so. But once again, not all sectors will be affected the same, and we need to be able to those gain in productivity eventually can be able to increase income for the overall economy, and hopefully to be able to help people in lower income. Because I mean, we at the same time we discovered, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, it's kind of bad to say it that way, but we discovered the importance of people who help us at a grocery store, who serve us in restaurant services. I mean, they were there and they were important before. It's kind of crazy. Like we're realizing it now because I mean we're kind of stuck. I mean, we took them for granted. So hopefully, humanly wise, we'll stop taking a lot of things for granted, and we care more about each other. I think it'll be important for the economics as well as for the well-being of society. And automation. I mean, of course, I mean, not everything will be doing through automation, but this will be bringing some key innovations and key increase in productivity, which may help, I mean, to increase wealth. I often say, I mean, without economic growth, we are condemned to share misery. So I don't mean to say we should be doing growth in any way possible. It doesn't mean we need to burn down the rainforest. It doesn't mean we shouldn't take care of the economy. On the contrary, we need to internalize all those externalities, and it's very important. And the developed world, developed economies need to realize that. We need to move beyond the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement. Hopefully, eventually, in the coming months or so, the United States will change some people which in the United States so that they will get back into the concert of nation. And so far, they're playing a very bad piece of music, which has worldwide consequences. And I'm being very polite here. But that being said, I think we need to find opportunities. There'll be challenges, but those challenges we need to transform into opportunities, economic and society opportunities for the well-being of the individuals and the households, the men, women, and children for the future.